And so the process that we have, again going back to the thymus, in instructing cells now, not just molecules, but individual cells whose professional business it is to control immune responses, is as follows: that these cells that are the precursor cells come into the thymus. Again, if they recognize our self very strongly, they get destroyed. In the case of B cells, they have an interesting thing, because they may recognize part of ourself, but there's a mechanism that we don't understand very well, which says, no, that ain't any good. Change your tune and recognize not flavor, strawberry, but raspberry, so that they can do what's called receptor editing. And finally, there's a production of these professional cells that regulate responses called regulatory T cells. And in the case of MS, all of the data that we have suggests that these cells are the cells that don't seem to function adequately. So that if things go out of control, these cells normally should bring things back into response, into control, and they don't. And these cells can be generated both in the thymus gland and, as given here, in the periphery, can also be generated there. And in fact, it turns out that the ones that can be produced outside in the tissue or the circulation may actually be even more important than the ones just normally there in the thymus gland. So again, the thymus has this process. It allows cells, instead of being damaged and killed, that recognize themselves, to recognize our tissues partly, a little more than usual, but as a consequence become cells that are the monitors of the immune response. And so we have a situation where we can remember things and have memory cells. We can have cells that get turned off, so they were functioning and don't. And then we have cells called regulatory T cells that block the process of the interaction of dendritic cells and other cells and prevent them from going ahead and becoming activated. And so we basically have a very sophisticated control system. These cells over here are central. These cells seem to not function adequately in MS, and instead of getting kicked in and controlling immune responses, allow the immune responses to actually occur. And the research that we're actually planning to do in the lab upstairs is actually focused on trying to understand how these regulatory T cells don't actually function. So again, how does one get an autoimmune disease? Well, behind it is a genetic inheritance, so that you have to have certain genes which allow some of these responses to occur, either because you recognize part of your myelin intrinsically compared with someone who may not recognize it. You may not produce enough cells or cells that respond adequately as these regulatory T cells. And so in the case of MS, for example, if there's an infection, and we know people with MS very seldom get respiratory infections, but when they get them, it may trigger an attack a week, 2, 3 weeks down the road. So what happens is that sets the train of the immune response becoming active, but these cells can't catch up and control it. And as a result, you end up with this process coming down and causing tissue injury, which in the case of MS is actually injuring myelin. Now again, this is another one of these, boy, there are a million things here. But one of the inherited parts of susceptibility to MS is that all of us have genes that are what we call tissue typing genes. So for example, if somebody's going to have a kidney transplant, we're trying to get a match. A match really means that you're finding somebody who has the same molecules of their immune system so that they would function potentially without rejecting that organ as a foreign tissue. And particularly one called HLA-DR may account for 40% of what seems to be the genetic inheritance. So while there is a genetic component in MS, there's also an environmental component, and it's also this interplay that occurs within our bodies against this constant barrage of infections or potential infections, controlling that, and also the ability and the need to prevent infections and reactions against our own tissues. And the net process is that if we go down the pathway and amplify the response, we not only have cells that can cause damage in the tissue, but we have memory cells that remain over that again can go over and over and amplify the process. So we lose what we call tolerance to our cells, and in that case, instead of stopping an immune response, we go ahead and cause inflammation and autoimmunity. Let me just skip this. Again, just to reemphasize that the regulatory T cells seem to be at the key of allowing the response to occur in MS that may allow this kind of inflammation. And this is not the brain, but this is just a picture of the skin showing many, many cells that are infiltrating it, in this case, an autoimmune response in the tissue itself. And the same, all these little sort of purple dots are lymphocytes or immune cells that normally shouldn't be in there. It should be nice and pink like over here. I deliberately haven't shown you a picture of myelin, but I've shown you a tissue to show that we can, by looking at the tissue, actually see this process occurring. So basically what I've tried to do is try to give you an idea of how the immune system functions, the complexity of the immune system. You don't have to worry about all the individual components of the immune system, but what I think is an important take-home message is that there are checks and balances. And if those checks and balances aren't there, you may end up getting one of 90 or more different kinds of autoimmune diseases. Everyone has the potential for getting an autoimmune disease. It's only those people who lose some of the regulatory mechanism that may actually get the autoimmune disease. We all have autoimmunity. We recognize our cells, but we don't necessarily respond against our cells and cause disease. And that's the difference between an autoimmune disease and the way the immune system normally recognizes, which inherently has to recognize our own tissues.